Good evening, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. If there are any empty seats beside you, could you possibly move in case we have any latecomers, because there's now a bit of a shortage of seats. So please move up and free the spare seats. I'd just like to welcome everybody back after our summer break, back to the 223rd session of talks for the Philosophical Society. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Pat Monaghan. I work here at the University of Glasgow, and I'm also the president of the Royal Philosophical Society of Glasgow, and it's a pleasure to see so many of you here this evening. I'm going to introduce this evening's speaker, but before I do so, I'll just remind you that if there's a fire, there are exits at the back and exits at the side. We're not expecting a fire alarm, but nor are we expecting a fire, so fingers crossed. This evening's speaker is Richard Ovenden, and he has the somewhat delightful title of being the head of gardens, libraries, and museums at the University of Oxford. So if you like, you can think of that. He's head of food for the soul and for the mind. He's the Bodley's Librarian, which means he's head of the 26 libraries at Oxford that come under the Bodleian Libraries. Of course, they cover a whole range of topics, but there's also a big central library, which is very well known. It's one of the major libraries in the world. It's been a library for over 400 years. Richard has not been a director for that long, but yes, I'm sure it feels like it sometimes, indeed. Prior to, he's also Professorial Fellow at Balliol College in Oxford. Prior to being at Oxford, he was in Scotland, and he was at the University of Edinburgh. And so Richard is a scholar and a researcher. And he, of course, is interested in books and their history. And he wrote a remarkable book relatively recently called Burning the Books, A History of the Deliberate Destruction of Knowledge. And that's the kind of thing we're going to hear about this evening. Now, his book was very well received. Jonathan Friedman in The Guardian said that it's a book in which the heroes are librarians. Now, they're not your typical heroes. They don't wear masks and capes and swashbuckle around, but what they do and have done throughout history is to be custodians and defenders of knowledge. And the defense of knowledge, of course, and defense of truth is something that is extremely topical today. So I'll hand you over to Richard. Burning the Books, the Social Importance of the Preservation of Knowledge.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that very generous introduction, Pat. And thank you all very much indeed for coming out and joining us this evening and for hearing my talk. Glasgow has a very special place in my heart, not least of which is because my wife was born in this city, and the 14 years that I spent in Scotland, much of it was spent in Glasgow, and I, of course, visited the great cultural institutions. I also visited Hampden Park on a number of occasions and could even be found in licensed premises on Sauchiehall Street on occasion. And of course, I use the wonderful university library here, both as a professional colleague coming through to Glasgow to talk to our sister institution here when I was at Edinburgh, but also as a scholar coming and using the collections in the university library and indeed in the Mitchell Library, which are just fabulous institutions. So when I was given the invitation, it was a no-brainer to come, have the excuse to come back to Glasgow. And of course, it also gives me a chance to pay tribute to what I think is one of Glasgow's greatest cultural achievements, which is the new head of mathematics, physical and life sciences in the University of Oxford is a Glaswegian, and he has industrial quantities of Tunnock's tea cakes, which are handed out at every meeting to the great delight of all those who have the pleasure of enjoying them. And as Pat said, I'm responsible for the great cultural and intellectual collections, scientific collections of the university, and for the past 11 years have been responsible for one of the great libraries of the world. And that's a wonderful thing to do. But this evening, what I want to do in this talk is to think about the role that libraries play for society, and one particular aspect is the preservation of knowledge. And libraries have gone through this great, particularly university libraries, this great focus on delivering services and focusing on their immediate communities, the needs and wants of their users. But I want to focus on the role of preserving knowledge as a service to society. And I'm going to look at that through the instances throughout history, or a number of case studies, where that role has been undermined by those who seek to destroy knowledge. And I want to show you some of the ways in which society, through the agency of libraries and archives, have responded to those threats. And at the end of the talk, I'm going to give you a proposition that there are 5 core functions of libraries and archives for society, and that role of preserving knowledge underpins all of those 5, and I'm going to try and leave you with that kind of notion at the end of my talk. But the trigger for me writing the book, Burning the Books, and for thinking about this topic was actually in 2018, I visited Berlin and walked around the site in which the events on the screen before you took place, right in the center of Berlin, just off unter den Linden, opposite what is now the State Library of Berlin, what is now very close to what is now the Humboldt University, near the State Opera House, not far from the Prussian Royal Palace, but a place on the 10th of November 1933 that the Nazi Party, with students, organized the pillaging of nearby libraries and bookshops, piled books in a great heap, poured petrol on them and set them on fire, whilst they chanted a series of incantations. And of course, the whole thing was filmed at the time and orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels as the students chanted against the idea that literature could be un-German, and those books on the pyre were considered to be un-German and therefore only worthy of being destroyed. And as I walked around this site, and there's a very moving plaque to it if you go and visit it, it occurred to me that the 10th of May 1933 wasn't actually that long ago. My mum was alive on the 10th of May 1933, and she's still alive today. And we forget these things, I think, at our peril. Around about the same time, I also into the world came the notion that there could be such things as alternate facts. This was a phrase coined by Kellyanne Conway, President Trump's press secretary, in defiance of the evidence that more people attended Barack Obama's inauguration in 2009 than attended Trump's in 2017. And as a librarian, this idea that there were alternate facts was a troubling one. But the real trigger for the book was discovering, in the heat of the then government's immigration policy known as the hostile environment, that the same government department, the Home Office that was instigating that policy, the Home Office, had destroyed an archive of documents that the same individuals who were being pursued under the hostile environment could have used to defend themselves, could have used to prove their right to settled status, their right to remain in the UK. And this destruction by the same civil servants occurred to me that this was a very good example of the social importance of the preservation of knowledge. This is not just documents that get piled up in basements. These are things which actually matter to people's lives. And so I wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times, and that resulted in the book that I published a few years ago. And my essential thesis in that book, and again, around about this time, I reread Orwell's 1984, which I hadn't read since I was a teenager. And if you haven't read it for a long time, I really recommend you go back to it, because it seems like a kind of a handbook for the age in which we live in, the age in which information is weaponized. And my essential thesis is that libraries and archives are institutions that help society cling to the truth. What I'd like to do now is just to give you a number of case studies going back in history about this topic. And I begin in the earliest libraries and archives that we know of, from the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia. And here in front of you is an image of what survives of the library of King Ashurbanipal of Assyria, formed in the 7th century before the Christian era. And really the first library that we know of to have been formed with the intention of encompassing the whole of human knowledge as it was understood at the time. And this was the focus of an exhibition at the British Museum, which is where I took this picture, called I Am Ashurbanipal. And what was extraordinary to me was that this museum exhibit had a library at its heart, but a library unlike anyone that I'd ever seen, a library made of clay tablets with cuneiform inscription pushed into the then wet clay, but the clay itself was solidified in the destruction of Nineveh, where the royal palace of Ashurbanipal was held, and a great library. And what we actually know of the library has been unraveled through the work of scholars since they were dug from the ruins of Nineveh by this man, Austin Henry Layard, a British explorer, archaeologist. The terms were very different in the mid-19th century, but he brought over 20,000 clay tablets back to the British Museum, and they've been deciphered by scholars ever since. The scholars are still working on them. But one of the extraordinary things that we know of Ashurbanipal's library is that he understood that the libraries of his enemies contained information that he wanted. And he targeted those libraries by sending his agents to go and steal or forcibly remove texts from those neighboring libraries. They were all kept in temples. I sometimes remind my staff of my kind of priestly role, only jokingly. But the correspondence that survives in the British Museum is extraordinary for revealing this idea that knowledge is power. Right back in the ancient world, the idea that if you took texts from your enemies' libraries, you would weaken their ability to do whatever it is that the text told them to do. And many of those texts were about the prediction of the future. So when was the ideal time to plant a crop? When was the ideal time to have children? When was the ideal time to go to war with your enemy? So if you took their knowledge away from them, you made your enemies weaker and you made yourself stronger. So this is a kind of ancient concept that libraries are at the heart of the control of knowledge, and knowledge is power. And this is John Martin's wonderful mezzotint of the fall of Nineveh. I'd now like to move on to what was arguably the greatest library of the ancient world, the great Library of Alexandria, written about by many of the ancient writers, and which in the Bodleian we have a kind of tenuous link back to the Library of Alexandria. This is the oldest surviving manuscript of Euclid's Elements of Geometry, one of the foundational texts of modern mathematics, and Euclid wrote this text in the Library of Alexandria. And for many centuries, it was thought, really right up until you watch Carl Sagan's Cosmos, as I did as a child, and you'll see there's one episode where he says, if he had a time machine, the place that he would most want to go back to was the Great Library of Alexandria before the fire, before the moment of its destruction, so that he could gather all the scrolls of lost knowledge. But of course, there was no fire. There was no moment of destruction. There was no cataclysm wherever this great library was destroyed. What modern scholars all agree on now is that certainly there was a great library, and it was generally regarded to be the greatest library of the ancient world. But by the 4th century of the Christian era, that library was gone. And that process was one of slow decline and neglect, and one where the library started off as a great symbol of royal patronage and prestige of the Ptolemaic kingdoms, the Hellenistic kingdom of Alexandria, but over time it lost its status and it lost its funding to the point now where you go to Alexandria and there's no generally regarded space that people point to and say, oh, this is where the library was. So that, to me, is a warning for our current age. If we neglect libraries or institutions that preserve knowledge, we risk losing that knowledge. I'd like us to move forward in time now to the Middle Ages, and I took this photograph standing in Glastonbury, in the west of England, in the ruins of the great Abbey of Glastonbury, a great Benedictine house, an enormously wealthy institution, so much so that the Abbey Church, which again is just in ruins now, was actually bigger than Canterbury Cathedral. So an incredibly powerful, rich, wealthy monastic house. And what you're looking at here is what remains of the great monastic library, one of the greatest libraries of the medieval world in these islands. And in 1539, the library was destroyed along with the rest of the abbey, and the abbot, John Whiting, was dragged up to Glastonbury Tor, hung, drawn and quartered, and the 4 parts of his body placed on spikes in neighbouring towns. But actually, we know quite a bit about the Library of Glastonbury Abbey, thanks to an archive of documents, which conveniently for me is in the Bodleian, formed by a man called John Leland. And John Leland, in the 1530s, was given a task by Henry VIII to survey all of the libraries in England and some outside of the realm, to search for information that would help him at first with his argument with the Pope to allow him to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry the beautiful young courtier Anne Boleyn, and then latterly to actually divorce the church in England from papal authority itself. And so Leland went around the country and took notes, took extensive notes of the libraries he visited, and we know that he visited Glastonbury because here's a list of the books that he looked at in 1533 or 1534. And we also know elsewhere in the archive is his comments about actually going to the library. So he knew what was in it. He was very excited about going there to see the great books in the library, and he recorded that no sooner as he crossed the threshold of the library that he swooned. He lost his balance. He was so excited at the mere sight of the great books, and he spent days looking at them. And here's a list of the books he saw, and if you look at the bottom of that list, you'll see the words Grammatica Euticis Liber Olim Sancti Dunstani. So this is a book of a now almost forgotten grammatical writer called Eutiches. but a book owned by St Dunstan. And actually on the other side of the screen is that very book. This is the book that Leland looked at in 1533 in the Library of Glastonbury Abbey, now called the Class Book of St Dunstan. And you can see St Dunstan kneeling at this picture of Christ, and this is arguably the earliest self-portrait in English art, in British art. And this book is a miscellany of texts from the 8th and 9th centuries. St Dunstan was the abbot of Glastonbury. He went on to be the abbot of Canterbury as well, the Archbishop of Canterbury, I should say. And this is one of only 60 books that survive from one of the greatest libraries in the medieval British Isles. So in the 13th century, the library catalogue listed almost 2,000 books. So by the 1530s, by 1539, when the monastery was dissolved, we don't know exactly how many books there were, but it would have been many thousands. And there are only 60 that survive, and this is one of them. And that process also happened in many other cities and towns and smaller individual houses in England, and latterly also in Scotland, obviously in Wales and Ireland as well, and certainly in Oxford. So the first university library was begun over 700 years ago in 1320. The building itself still survives, and more books came, and the university in the 15th century had to build a bigger room. You can see that on the screen in front of you. And that room was visited in the 1550s, in late 1549, 1550, by the commissioners of Edward VI in the most kind of extreme phase of the Protestant Reformation. And the books were taken out and the pages torn up and sold to butter makers to wrap butter in, and pie makers to line pie dishes. And there was a phrase at the time that books were dog cheap and whole libraries in Oxford could be had for an inconsiderable nothing. So this attempt to control knowledge by controlling the contents of libraries, and this library had been very important in the generation before by being one of the first places to bring in the knowledge of humanism through a gift from a man called Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. And many of those manuscripts, because they were all manuscript books, their pages were sold to bookbinders to line the bindings of the new technology, the technology of print. And you can see a couple of examples on the screen there. So this wave of destruction, which obviously didn't just happen in Oxford, but certainly did happen in Oxford, prompted a response. And one of the things I want to leave you with is this idea that there is a great human impulse to preserve knowledge or to restore it when it has been destroyed. And this was certainly the case with this man. This is Sir Thomas Bodley, after whom the library I'm responsible for is named. And he visited the ruins of that room that I showed you just a few moments ago and found it laid waste, found all the shelves empty and none of that knowledge there, even though he was himself quite an extreme Protestant, a Calvinist. He'd literally been taught by John Calvin, that he nevertheless regarded it as a great waste of knowledge that those books had been destroyed, and in other libraries in these islands. And he dedicated himself to rebuilding the library in the university and to re-establishing it. And at the heart of his founding statutes, the instructions he gave to my predecessor, the first librarian, and all of the arrangements that he put in place was the preservation of knowledge, that we would not lose books and knowledge like his predecessors did, our predecessors in Oxford and elsewhere did. So that kind of piece of DNA, and he disinherited his family and poured all his own wealth, mobilized his network to re-establish the library, which he did in 1602. That idea of the dedication to preserving knowledge, again, is very important in the library's history. So here's one example of that, and which is that in the 1840s. John Milton, the great poet, was friends with one of my predecessors, John Rouse, the second librarian, and presented a volume of his own works to the library with a specially handwritten dedication poem. And, but of course, Milton was one of the signatories of the death warrant of Charles I. And so at the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, the works of the regicides like Richard Baxter and Milton were prohibited. And in fact, on 2 occasions, they were ordered by royal decree to be burned. And in Oxford, that burning took place actually in the quadrangle outside the library. But my predecessor, Thomas Hyde, the 5th librarian, refused to give up the precious book of Milton. And he hid it, he deleted the entry from the library's catalogue and hid the book, presumably at some risk to his own self. So that idea of actually that commitment to preserving knowledge goes back a long way. I'd like to move us further forward in time now to 1814. And to an episode in British history, which as a history student and scholar, at least sometimes, I was certainly, as a young person, not taught about. And this is the burning of Washington by British forces, led by this man in this rather wonderful mezzotint called Sir George Cockburn. And he took a British expeditionary force to North America in 1812. There was then 2 years of war, which culminated in the siege of Washington and the burning of the city. And in fact, extraordinarily, we have an eyewitness account from the British perspective of what happened in August 1814. And you can see some of the detail in the mezzotint behind me. And it actually comes from a Glaswegian, George Robert Gleig, who not only was born in Glasgow, but came to study in Balliol College, which has a great link with the University of Glasgow, so the college where I'm a fellow now. And Gleig wrote this account of the burning of Washington, which he described as a scene he'd never seen anything more sublime than the burning city. But even he, as a soldier, regarded that a noble library, several printing offices, and all the National Archives were committed to the flames, which might better have been spared. So even he kind of conceded that it wasn't the finest hour of the British forces to destroy the Library of Congress, which was kept in the Congress building, which at the time, Washington was only founded in 1800, was the only stone-built building in the city. And here you can see this watercolor, which shows, you can see on the outside the windows the soot left by the evidence of the flames and the smoke pouring out of this building. And this became a major, obviously a major issue. The burning of Washington was a major issue, but the destruction of the Library of Congress, which was established for the congressmen themselves, for the politicians in the legislature, but also for the civil servants in the executive to manage the country. And it really weakened their ability to do that. And news of the destruction of the library reached Thomas Jefferson, of course, one of the founders of the new country, one of the first presidents, but who also had the finest private library in North America at the time. And he had retired to his estate in Monticello, not that far from Washington, heard about the destruction of the library, and wrote a letter to the newspaper in Washington expressing his outrage at the barbarism of the British and invoking the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, and then offering his own library to replace the burned books. Not actually as a gift, but at kind of mates' rates. And eventually Congress, it's actually quite interesting if you read the debates in Congress, it took them actually many months to decide whether or not to vote the money to replace the books, but eventually they did, and the Library of Congress was kind of reborn and became the great institution that it is today. August, ladies and gentlemen, is not a great month for libraries. So August 1814 was a bad month for the Library of Congress. A century later, it was a very bad month for the university library in the Catholic University of Louvain, or Leuven in Belgium. Regarded as one of the most beautiful cities in Belgium, which had not been an independent country for that long. It's only had its independence not even a century beforehand, but had an ancient university and a great library, which had not only books for the university, but a bit like Glasgow University Library, you know, items of great cultural heritage importance, items that attracted scholars from all over the world. But in August 1914, German troops invaded neutral Belgium, they occupied Louvain, and on the night of August the 25th, they set fire to the library and it was destroyed. And it became an international outrage. And you can see in many newspapers, this is actually one from the Irish Times, that people all over the world were outraged at the barbarism of the Germans this time. And just like George Washington, the symbol of the destruction of the Library of Alexandria was invoked again, even though they didn't realize it was a myth. And actually, if you ever have a kind of bored moment, I encourage you to go to the Google Books Ngram viewer, which is a kind of word frequency count and against printed literature. And I just put Louvain into the Google Books Ngram viewer, and you get this big spike after 1914 where everybody's talking about the destruction of the Library of Louvain. So much so that after the war, the Americans decided this was going to be an opportunity for the exercise of soft power. And they decide to take it upon themselves to rebuild the structure of the library. Now, the Treaty of Versailles actually had a special clause requiring the people of Germany to fund the restocking of the library, of the books, replacing the books themselves. The Americans said, no, we're going to rebuild the actual structure. And this is an architect's sketch, a watercolor, by a firm of architects called Warren and Wentmore, who were hired to redesign the library in Louvain. And what they decided to do was to make it exactly the same as the old library. So that sort of Northern European vernacular style. But the important thing here is the little cartouche that you can see, which says, designed for the library at Louvain, destroyed by Germans 1914, restored by America 1922. So this was the great ambition. And a committee headed by President Nicholas Murray Butler, the Butler Library in Columbia University is named after him, was formed to raise the money, but actually it took them much longer than anticipated to raise the money. And eventually they went begging to John D. Rockefeller, who wrote a big check to make good the shortfall. And in that passage of time, the library, the relations between the Belgians and their neighbors, the Germans, got better. And they really decided that they wanted to get on with the Germans and not remember the rather unpleasant incidents of August 1914. And so the architects had decided to put a big plaque with the legend, destroyed by Germans, restored by America, in large lettering on the side of the library. And the Belgians didn't like this at all. And in the middle of the night, just before the grand opening of the library, somebody climbed up in a ladder and smashed it. And this caused a kind of international incident. And it resolved itself eventually by the Americans admitting defeat, putting the plaque with this legend on it outside of the city, and eventually it was one of the incidents that made America kind of withdraw from European affairs in the 1930s. Sadly, even though the library was indeed rebuilt in the 1930s by America and restocked, actually not just by Germans, but by an international effort, the library was destroyed again in 1940 by German troops. And it then had to be rebuilt a second time after World War II, and it's still there, and you can see it looks very much like the earlier versions. Of course, the Holocaust of the middle of the 20th century is perhaps the period in history where the most severe destruction of knowledge has taken place. And I'd like to take you to the city of Vilnius in Lithuania, or Vilna, as it's now known, a city famous for its learned rabbis like the Vilna Gaon, but also a city famous for its libraries, like the Strashun Library, gifted at the end of the 19th century to the Jewish community by a wealthy businessman, which had a vibrant reading room and a learned librarian on the eve of World War II. And there was another important institute called YIVO, which had been founded in 1922 to document the lives of ordinary Jewish people in Central and Eastern Europe, and the lives that those people lived, particularly using the Yiddish language. And so the YIVO Institute collected music hall posters and newspapers and medical case notes and diaries, all in the Yiddish language. And then, of course, in 1941, Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa on the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, and behind the stormtroopers came a kind of cultural stormtrooper. And this was an operational group led by the man you can see in front of the piles of books, called Johannes Pohl, who had actually been a librarian in the State Library of Berlin and was a bibliophile. But he was there to find books that would be sent back from the occupied cities of Central and Eastern Europe to an institute founded by the man, the other man, who's called Alfred Rosenberg, who was one of the chief architects of anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany, and who founded a kind of perverted research institute called the Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question in Frankfurt. So the books stolen from Jewish communities would be sent to the Frankfurt Institute. And this happened all over occupied Europe, including in Vilna, including the libraries, the Strashun Library and the YIVO Institute. And here you can see that the method in which those books were sent back to Frankfurt was by identifying librarians, archivists and scholars in the ghetto in Vilna, who were forced at gunpoint to come out of the ghetto each day, go into the libraries and archives and sort through the collections. Some would be sent back to Frankfurt, the others sent to the paper mills for destruction. And so as a librarian, I can tell you that having to do that must have been absolutely appalling. And to be having to do it at gunpoint, to destroy the library that you had been responsible for, but one that represented the lives of your community, the spirit, the intellectual history, the social history of your own community. And these individuals, the scholars and librarians, called themselves the Paper Brigade. And what they decided to do was to try and smuggle books and documents back into the ghetto each day. And they would hide them in their clothes. They persuaded the Nazis that they needed paper to light the fires in the kitchens in the ghetto. They said, oh, we need chairs in the schools, and they were allowed to bring, tubular metal chairs, which they hid documents in the tubes of the metal, risking their own lives. If they'd have been caught, they would have been murdered. Now, in the ghetto was liquidated. All the members of the ghetto were murdered, with a few exceptions who had escaped and joined partisans in the forests. And when the Soviet army pushed the Nazis out in 1944, the ghetto was reoccupied, and the documents that had been hidden by the Paper Brigade in the ghetto were recovered and found again. And this is actually an image, I'm pretty sure it's a reconstruction, it's not a documentary photograph, of a similar incident that happened in Warsaw. So this is the Warsaw ghetto after the war, where a group called Oyneg Shabez, founded by an extraordinary man called Emanuel Ringelblum, had hid documents to do with the Warsaw Ghetto, hid them in the rubble of the ghetto in the hope that someone would recover them after the end of the war, which indeed is what happened. They hid them. You can see the metal milk canisters and so on that they hid the documents in. Now, the Frankfurt Institute was seized by American troops in 1945, and they found this vast collection of books and documents. And they began a long process of trying to return them to the rightful owners or their heirs. And the YIVO Institute, by chance, had, before the war, opened a small office in New York. And this was all that remained that they could find out about the American troops. And so they sent all the books and documents that had the YIVO ownership stamp on them to this tiny office in New York, and you can see the staff kind of unpacking hundreds of packing crates. But the documents that had been recovered in the ruins of the ghetto by the Soviet troops and the survivors, the few members of the paper brigade that had survived, fell foul of communist ideology in 1945 and 46. Who decided that these books were un-communist. They'd been un-German at one point, and now they were un-Soviet. And so they were sent to the paper mills again. And this time, that impulse for preservation fell to this man, Antanas Ulpis, who was a Lithuanian librarian, and he went to the paper mills and took control of 2 of these trucks loaded with documents and drove them back to a branch of the National Library of Lithuania that was in a former church. And he hid them amongst all of the Lithuanian books and documents, including in the organ pipes of the church. And he kept it a secret until 1989, when this great trove of documents, this great trove of a community's life was rediscovered, and they're being digitized by the YIVO Institute in New York and the National Library of Lithuania. And again, this attempt to control knowledge through deliberate destruction, we also saw in the Cultural Revolution, even though Mao Zedong had been a librarian. Not a lot of people know that, as Michael Caine probably never said. But, you know, extraordinary amounts of destruction took place during the Cultural Revolution of knowledge. I said that August was a bad month for libraries, and it was a very bad month in 1992. So again, not that long ago, really. You know, it's not long ago that the National and University Library of Sarajevo, or the National University Library of Bosnia and Herzegovina in the city of Sarajevo, was targeted by Serb militia in August 1992. Only that building was targeted that day with incendiary shells. And the librarians and firefighters that tried to rescue books from the burning building were targeted by snipers. And one of the librarians was murdered on that day. And that happened across Bosnia and Kosovo during the Balkan conflicts as Serb forces tried to eradicate the memory of a multicultural society where Jews and Muslims and Christians had lived, coexisted for centuries. They even targeted land registries so that records of Muslim land ownership would be eradicated. And Slobodan Milosevic and Ratko Mladic were indicted at the International War Crimes Tribunal and some of the indictments were for the destruction of libraries, including the one in Sarajevo. So I'd like to leave you at as we're getting near to the end of my talk, with my kind of shtick. And my shtick is that the social importance of the preservation of knowledge devolved to libraries and archives on behalf of society is part of the infrastructure of democracy. And there are 5 functions of libraries and archives that I would like to highlight to you. And the first of these is their role as educational institutions, or institutions that support education. And this is, of course, the most obvious one, the kind of thing that most people would think of, and one with kind of ancient lineage, obviously going back to the great libraries of the ancient world, but also through the medieval world and across different cultures as well. And this idea that libraries support the education not just of individuals but of whole communities and society as a whole is one which great philosophers who have been librarians have written about. You think of Leibniz in Germany, but you also think in Scotland of David Hume. And that role of the preservation of knowledge is informing and educating society. Here's one example from my own institution, which has one of the original engrossments of Magna Carta, which the great jurist William Blackstone, who was a fellow of All Souls College, consulted when it arrived in the library in 1749, just in time for him to finish his great book on Magna Carta. And you find that book in the library of Thomas Jefferson and of the great the revolutionary leaders of the American Revolution, and indeed in some of the libraries of the revolutionary leaders in France. It's 175 years ago this year that William Ewart brought forward a bill to establish free public libraries in Britain. It took the Public Libraries Act of 1850 was then repeated, had a separate legislation for Scotland in 1853, but that core debate where he introduced the bill was for institutions of public libraries that were instruments of public improvement. So that idea that it's not just individuals who benefit from libraries and their educational function, it's the public as a whole. And you see that in all sorts of ways. There's a wonderful quote from the letter of application for a reader's ticket at the British Museum Library, what is now the British Library, in the late 1890s from Sylvia Pankhurst, where she is saying she needs to have a reader's ticket for the library because she's working on the theories of the education of women. And then this idea that libraries, particularly after the 1850 Act, are for the whole nation, not just for the middle classes or for the upper echelons of society, but for the working classes as a whole, becomes more pervasive. And this idea of libraries being important for educating a citizenry that enables a nation to move forward. And we, across our libraries, university libraries, public libraries today, we still take that educational role incredibly important. And there's one little story I want to highlight to you about the educational role of libraries, which is about the role of libraries preserving boring knowledge. Like really dull books, but sometimes they can be incredibly important. And I don't know if any of you have seen the film Spotlight, which is a film about a real-life case of investigative journalism which exposed sexual abuse in the Catholic priesthood in Boston. And the journalists were able to piece evidence together from going into the Boston Public Library and other libraries in the city of Boston, where they found old parish newspapers, parish magazines, clerical directories, which were long out of date, which were kind of things which I took, if I took the senior leadership of Oxford University round the stacks of the Bodleian and they saw these things, they think, what, Richard, why on earth are you keeping all of this junk, all this out-of-date stuff? But by going back to it, they could piece together the movement of these priests and connect it to witness statements and to the fact that the Catholic hierarchy were moving these priests around rather than dealing with them. So my little plea for the preservation of boring knowledge. And more recently, you saw the destruction of knowledge, particularly targeting education and libraries, when the Taliban took over Afghanistan again in August 2021. And some of the first things they did was to target very small, very humble libraries that had been established for educating young women. And they videoed the destruction of them and put them on social media. And I wrote about it again in the FT. So the second of my 5 functions is about diversity, and not just the diversity of languages that libraries bring in, which might otherwise be unavailable to a society or community, but a diversity of ideas, a diversity of approaches. And we see at this moment in time that we're living in now that this role, this idea of the diversity of knowledge is being challenged, including here in the UK. And you see it very much in the current presidential debates where J.D. Vance is accusing librarians of putting sexually explicit books in toddlers' libraries. But you know, there is a fight back. It's a very current political agenda in America at the moment. You know, even the books, you know, the state of Utah a few months ago banned Margaret Atwood's books from its libraries statewide. Margaret Atwood, you know, it's extraordinary how the control of knowledge is being weaponized. And we saw just at the beginning of August in the anti-immigration rioting that one of the libraries in Liverpool that had been creating services for immigrant communities was targeted by the mob for destruction. But again, that kind of impetus for renewal, for preservation in society is very, very strong. It took just a few days for several £100,000 to be donated by a GoFundMe campaign. And this idea of a diversity of knowledge is really important for the health of democracy, for the health of an open society. And this idea goes back to kind of philosophical ideas at the heart of liberal democracy, like Mill's On Liberty, or more recently, the great Harvard philosopher John Rawls. And again, you know, there is an epidemic of book banning across America, but librarians are organizing, fighting back against the book bans, even the Bodleian public libraries digitizing banned texts to make them available across state lines, and state legislatures are overturning some of their decisions. Sorry, I'm going to speed up as I realize I'm running out of time. The third of my functions is more about archives, and it's about preserving the rights of citizens. And I contrast what happened in Germany, in East Germany after 1989, where citizens marched into Stasi headquarters to stop Stasi officials burning documents that demonstrated who was informing, who the informers were in those societies, with what happened after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, where the state archives were basically removed to America by American forces. And the way that Germany dealt with, if you like, the necessity of being honest about what had happened in the communist era. And you think of laws and the access by citizens to the laws of the land being incredibly important. And it brings me to the topic of digital preservation, where in 2011 the Harvard Law Library did a survey of the website of the Supreme Court of the United States and found that no fewer than 40% of the web links were broken. So, you know, the access to knowledge of law is absolutely essential for a healthy society. The fourth of my 5 functions is around reference points for facts and truth. And this old idea that you have to verify your references, and the idea of libraries being places where knowledge is trusted, and things that we've been used to for centuries, shelf marks, which we now, in the digital realm, use persistent identifiers, all sorts of digital equivalents of those shelf marks, which means that you can verify knowledge. And as we move as a society to where knowledge is created and disseminated using online platforms which are privately owned, like by the big companies like Meta and Google, we find libraries who do not have archiving in their business models. We find libraries like the National Library of New Zealand trying to persuade New Zealanders to donate their Facebook profiles so that they can build a record of New Zealand life. And of course, we saw with the recent WhatsApp debates over Partygate and so on, how important it has been for the use of how sometimes politicians and special advisors have tried to hide their communication about public policy, and how important in terms of records legislation that we need to catch up with it, private messaging. And we saw just how powerful social media and an iPhone and a Twitter account were for President Trump's political career, but he deleted hundreds of, in fact, thousands of tweets during his time as president, but a kind of activist, archivist group called Fact-Based screenshotted every single time he tweeted and kept all the ones that he deleted. I'm going to skip through this now. The final of my 5 functions is about identity, and you only need to look at what is happening in Ukraine at the moment to find that the role of libraries and archives in preserving the identity of a community and society is being challenged by Russian forces. When they go into occupied territories, they take books out of the libraries in Ukrainian or about Ukraine and they burn them. And there's been a whole swathe of, hundreds of libraries attacked, deliberately destroyed, and we're doing a tiny bit to try and preserve the social media space to do with Ukraine. You can read some more about this in my piece in The Atlantic. But I think what our colleagues in the library sector in Ukraine are doing at the moment is kind of next level service to society, turning their basement stacks into bomb shelters. So I'm going to leave you with George Orwell, who, as ever, sums it up much better than I can. So thank you very much indeed for listening.
Okay, we have time for some questions.
I think we've got one down there.
Can you hear me okay? Is it switched on? Yeah. Are we more likely to have a ministry of truth in the age of the internet and digitization? And should we retain our paper records at all cost?
So I think we should retain paper records, but I think we have to accept that there's so much information that's only created in digital form now. So we have to grapple as a society with the preservation of digital information that is born digital. And that includes now, Boris Johnson's WhatsApp messages includes our email. You know, try and find an email that you received 20 years ago, and you realize just how difficult it is. Technologically, it's not that difficult. We know how to do it, and I speak as president of the Digital Preservation Coalition, which has its office here or one of its offices here in Glasgow. So we really need to engage with this problem if we're to keep information for the health of an open society. And I'll give you one example from the Digital Preservation Coalition, which started off with 10 libraries and archives, and there now is over 200 organisations, including the UK Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, because it's quite important for society to keep the information about where we stored nuclear waste, what it was contained in, all of that kind of information. We don't just need to keep it for 10 years, we need to keep it for 10,000 years. So that's how important that topic is.
Thank you for a really good talk. It was most interesting. Thank you. I just wanted to ask you, is there a requirement from some organisations, like the police, for example, to actually house their documents in archives? Or is it up to them whether they do so or whether they destroy them?
No, that's part of the kind of National Archives legislation, that certain classes of documents have to be kept for different periods of time. You know, it varies from type of document, type of function that those documents serve, how they have to be kept. So there's a salt mine in Cheshire. It's a great business model where they dig salt out of the ground that gets spread on our roads in the winter. But the chambers that are revealed from this great seam of salt are then floored out and used to store basically court records and police records for the statutory periods, after which they're normally destroyed, but they have to be kept for periods of time. And of course it varies, you know, some organisations have to keep some records for legal reasons, but some then are to do with, you know, the long-term, are not subject to legal requirement, but are decisions that are taken for, if you like, societal reasons, for historical reasons, for, you know, long-term access to knowledge, which you find in local authority archives or the National Archives. And that is a more difficult issue because it's one then which is based on available resources for the good care and custody of those documents over time.
Hello, you gave a very vivid description of the Nazis' destruction of books. Have we any knowledge of the extent to which it was successful? In other words, was it merely symbolic, or did they actually manage to eradicate for all time a great chunk of information and literature?
They did, yes, absolutely. I mean, you know, millions of books were burned in kind of ceremonial burnings, like the one on the 10th of May 1933 in Berlin. And that happened across German cities, but also in occupied territories where whole libraries were sometimes destroyed, others where it was more a selective stealing, a selecting theft of books, where others were then either burned or sent to paper mills for pulping, more commonly. And sometimes, for example, the French Secret Service archive was overrun by German troops in 1941 and then moved to Czechoslovakia, what is now the Czech Republic, actually, where German Secret Service agents pored over it and uncovered the identities of, you know, French spies and so on. And then Soviet troops overran that in 1944 and took it to Moscow. And so there are huge bodies of documents that were seized by Soviet troops from German locations where they had been seized. So this is one where in the book I distinguish slightly between knowledge that has been destroyed or just removed from the community to which it really belongs and kind of stolen, but could be returned. And as indeed some of those archives were returned after 1989 by the Russians to France, like the Secret Service archive, for example.
Should you be worried by artificial intelligence?
Yes, but I'm not sure that we need to be worried by artificial intelligence necessarily for the destruction of knowledge, but more for the manipulation of knowledge, for the control of knowledge. And partly because it's dependent on being fed with information, particularly the large language models depend on large volumes of data, mostly words. And those large language models have been built by scraping information off the open web, sometimes without permission from bits of the closed web. And those companies that specialize in doing those whole domain crawls have now run out of data for the large language models because they're so data hungry. And they've hit what they now call the data frontier. And I think that means that the outputs of generative AI are skewed because the open web does not represent the entirety of human knowledge, as any librarian or archivist will tell you. We've got massive amounts of knowledge that is not digitized and not available online. And so how can generative AI be an accurate representation of human history, human experience, human knowledge? It can't.
A book written 500 years ago is still completely readable today, but the knowledge that we have on floppy disks, on microfilm, on videotape, etc., that's only accessible if you have the technology to interrogate it. Is there a program to actually keep old technology so that knowledge is still available?
Yes, there is. There are many organizations. So I mentioned earlier the Digital Preservation Coalition, which is a group of institutions that share the need to do exactly what you've described and to ensure that information held in digital form can be accessible over the long term. And so the community of technologists, but librarians and archivists have developed techniques, shared approaches, shared standards, which enable information to be accessible. So in the Bodleian, we have a room full of outdated technology that we keep alive, where we can put ancient floppy disks in and take the data off and put it into servers and maintain the noughts and ones so that they can be rendered and used. So we have the technology. What we don't have is the money, because it's expensive to do. And one of the challenges that librarians and archivists face is that we have the legacy of the analog era, parchment, paper, papyrus, but we also have the legacy, and a growing legacy, of the digital era. So, you know, we took in the archive of Edward Heath, the Prime Minister, and there were boxes and boxes of, just as you described, floppy disks, formats. I can't imagine the machines that would have taken these in huge old floppy disks. So we've got that sort of role of digital archaeology. But increasingly, we have information that's held on the big social media platforms, or, I don't know, do you use Dropbox or Facebook or any of those networks, platforms where you can keep information for free. Of course, nothing's free, but you know, keeping track of all of that is a great challenge, and we're increasingly finding things like digital wills, so that people leave information about where they kept their pictures on Flickr or, you know, whatever social media platforms, and the passwords. So Barbara Castle, Baroness Castle, left us her archive, which was about 500 boxes of paper and 2 PCs, but she didn't leave us the passwords. So my staff had to hack into the machines, and so please, everyone, think about this thing. Think about this.
Do you have a striking illustration of how rapidly digitization is progressing? For instance, 10 years ago, how long would it take to digitize the Bodleian or the Vatican Library, for that matter? And how long would it take now with modern developments in 10 years?
Well, it's certainly easier to do digitization. It's cheaper than it was 10 years ago. I remember being in the National Library of Scotland when the first digital camera came into the photographic studio there in about 1993 or something like that. And the ability to take images at the same resolution as that machine could now, where's it gone? You could do it on this. But, you know, the Bodleian has 23 million collection items. So that's 23 million by an average of 200 pages. So the task of digitizing all of that is a huge one. We're about 4% of the way through the collection, and that's through partnerships actually with the Vatican Library, with Google, with other big technology companies. So it's going to take an awful lot of time, an awful lot of money to do all of that. And that's just one library, right, a big one, but it's one library. So yes, it's becoming cheaper. Yes, there is more demand for the data that we create through that, like from the AI companies, but it's a vast task.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for a very illuminating talk. But going back to the 1933 German Nazi book burning, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the great German poet Heinrich Heine in 1833 said that once you start burning books, how long will it be before you start burning people?
I print that quote at the start of my book.
Oh, well, I haven't read your book.
Still available in paperback at all good bookshops. And I think that you're absolutely right to say that. And I think we saw that again in Bosnia. So, you know, it's whatever it is, 27 years since the massacre at Srebrenica. So you have to link these two things together. You cannot disassociate them from one another, sadly. But I think also we've got to remember the flip side of that is this human impulse to preserve and to rebuild knowledge. So after exactly a year after the 10th of May 1933, the Library of Banned Books was opened in Paris. And that was a library of all of the titles and authors who the Nazi propaganda machine had targeted with destruction. And a similar one opened in New York, and actually the Marx Memorial Library in London, I discovered after I wrote the book, somebody wrote to me and said, "Did you know that?" It wasn't Michael Caine. Did you know that the Marx Memorial Library was founded as a response to the 10th of May 1933?
Yes, hello. Could I ask what your views are on ritual destruction of other cultural items? I'm thinking in particular about the destruction of the Beatles' musical recordings, and also in the 60s and later in the 70s, the Disco Sucks movements where records were ritually destroyed.
So I missed that last bit.
About destruction of musical records.
Of the destruction of music. Do you mean musical instruments or musical scores?
Musical recordings.
Musical recordings. Yeah. Well, certainly it's one of these issues which, so I don't know an awful lot about it, I confess. But certainly the need to reformat and copy from older recording methods. And I think this is one of the things that come up in a number of the questions, where actually for millennia, knowledge has been preserved through copying. Scribes did it in the Middle Ages. Printers did it from the invention of printing. So that process of copying, photography made a huge difference in the ability to copy. And obviously now digitization. And I think that's one of the areas, musical recordings is one of the areas where it's particularly challenging to do that recording at the right level, at the right degree of fidelity. It's expensive to do. You find, the British Library has the National Sound Archive. National Library of Scotland has one here in Kelvin Hall with film, but also it's sound as well, isn't it? So, this is one where actually society needs to put more resources into it, which takes us back to Alexandria. We lost Alexandria, decayed and was eventually disappeared because of societal neglect. And I think we run that risk in our society today as we're underfunding or not properly funding libraries and archives to do that preservation function. And not just for books and documents, but you're absolutely right, for musical recordings, for TV, for all kinds of forms of the cultural record, as that cultural record has changed in its format.
Thank you.
Thank you. Following on from that question relating to music, if I'm allowed to quote from Chris Christopherson and his sad demise yesterday, I think one of his lyrics refers to someone's lived experience being part fact and part fiction. In fact, he lived his life as a walking contradiction. And it seems to me that from some of the information given this evening, what really rests at the heart of it is this whole process of censorship and what constitutes knowledge and what constitutes truth and who decides what stays and what goes. And to what extent, I'd be interested to hear how we can help shape the future policies for our repositories, libraries within the UK in terms of the constraints of storage and cost and these censorship needs. I use the word needs loosely in inverted commas.
Thank you. Well, there's quite a few questions in there, but really important ones and good ones. And I think, so the question of censorship is a critical one because, librarians and archivists do need to decide not absolutely everything can or indeed should be kept. And everything that is kept costs money to keep it going. And so there are kind of critical decisions that can be made. And in the past, those decisions, you can see them as being kinds of censorship because information about women or underrepresented members, what we now regard as underrepresented members of society were not regarded as important to be kept. I'll give you one shameful episode from my own library in the early 19th century when we were given as a copyright library copies of new books free of charge, as indeed we still are. But in the early 19th century, we had free copies come to the library of the first edition of Persuasion, Sense and Sensibility, Northanger Abbey, you name it. And my predecessors, because at that point the Bodleian was in an institution that only educated men, decided, why would we want to keep these books? Why on earth would we want to keep them? And so they didn't. But then in the by sort of 1870, 1880, Oxford had got 2 or 3 women's colleges. Women had been admitted into the Bodleian Library a couple of decades before, and the English faculty was founded. And the professors of the English faculty came to the library wanting to read the first editions of Jane Austen and Mary Shelley, and we didn't have them. So those issues are kind of critically tied up with the role of librarian and archivist. And I think that's why in the ancient world they were all priests, because knowledge is precious, and it's important, not just now. Those decisions make a huge impact long into the future. And so we take that role very seriously. That's why we need to have, value the role of librarians and archivists in society, educate them properly, pay them properly, have a succession planning, apprenticeships, all of those kinds of things, so that the people in those positions make good decisions. And I think part of that is erring on the side of preservation, erring on the side of keeping, because sometimes you need to keep false information as well as true information so that you can tell the difference between the two.
Okay, I think we're going to have to stop, more or less, stop the questions at least. I said at the beginning that the title of Richard's job was one that was concerned with food for the mind and the soul. And I think we've had food for the mind and the soul, certainly this evening. Richard has told us about the defense of knowledge, the defense of libraries. He's told us about great libraries that were deliberately destroyed. But even more chilling was that great libraries can be lost just because we don't care about them anymore. And when you look at your public library and you think, what are all those books in there for? Should we be giving money to public libraries? If we lose them, we'll be very sorry that we let that happen.
The infrastructure of democracy.
Indeed. Indeed, he's also told us about the storage of documents and how important the libraries are for that. And also, he made me think that sometimes I look at libraries full of old science books and I think they're out of date, we don't need them anymore. But actually, they are a record of the history of knowledge acquisition and how knowledge has changed. So maybe those old books are also very important. So I'd like to thank Richard on behalf of all of us for giving us so much to think about. Now I have 2 tasks that I have to do, and I mustn't forget to do them. One is that the Society, of course, has a Minerva medal, Minerva being the god of knowledge, and I'm going to present Richard with the Society's Minerva medal. Of course, that's not all he's getting, because he has to get the Society paperweight also. So will you join me, please? I'll present on behalf of the Royal Philosophical Society of Glasgow the Minerva medal to Richard Ovenden. Thank you.
Thank you. This is fantastic. How wonderful. That's just fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, so the next talk is about how frogs can help us mend a broken heart. And there's a glass of wine and soft drinks in the foyer. Thank you.